Her name was never really hers. Not the last name, not the spelling, not the identity the world attached to it. When researchers traced her bloodline back through the silence that slavery left behind, what they found was that the story of Dionne Warwick's name was not an accident, it was a pattern, one that ran all the way back to a plantation in Florida and to a man who was listed in a government census, not by his name, not by his story, not by anything that made him a human being, but by his age, his color, and his gender. A number in a column, the property of someone else. The DNA changed that. Not completely, not with the certainty that delivers every answer to every question, but enough. Enough to give him back a face. Enough to trace a bloodline from a Florida cotton field to one of the most celebrated voices in American music history. Enough to raise a question that the science confirmed but could never fully close. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. Dionne Warwick was born Marie Dionne Warwick with 2 R's on December 12, 1940 in East Orange, New Jersey. The name she became famous under was not the name she was born with. A printing error on the cover of her first record changed Warwick to Warwick, dropped one letter, added another, and created the spelling she would carry for the rest of her career. She hated it. She said so repeatedly, for decades. By the time she found out, the records had already gone out, the labels had already been printed, and the moment to correct it had passed. A name taken by error. It was not the first time a name in her family had been taken. Dionne Warwick grew up inside a gospel music dynasty. Her mother, Lee Drinkard Warwick, managed the Drinkard Singers, a family gospel group that recorded the first gospel album released on a major label and performed at Carnegie Hall and the Newport Jazz Festival. Her grandfather, Nicholas Drinkard, known to everyone as Nitch, was a fixture of the Newark gospel community, a man with a beautiful tenor voice and a faith so deep it organized the entire family around it. Her aunt was Sissy Drinkard Houston. Sissy's daughter was Whitney Houston. The same bloodline that produced Dionne Warwick produced Whitney Houston. The same family roots, the same gospel tradition, the same lineage running back through Georgia and Florida to a history that nobody in the family had been told in full. That is where the investigation began. Not with Dionne's fame, not with her chart history, not with the 6 Grammy Awards or the Hollywood Walk of Fame, with what she did not know. With the wall that sits in almost every African American family tree, somewhere around 1865, where the names disappear and the paper trail dissolves into the silence that slavery designed. She knew she was strong. She said it herself before the research began. She knew her family was strong, the kind of people who built something out of nothing, who moved north and made music, and raised children who went on to move the world with their voices. But she did not know where that strength came from. Not fully, not in the specific name, documented way that the investigation was about to provide. Henry Louis Gates Jr. and his team at Finding Your Roots spent months on the Warwick family tree. Finding Your Roots is not a consumer ancestry product. It is a research operation, genealogists working alongside geneticists, cross-referencing documentary evidence with DNA analysis, checking and rechecking results before presenting them. The methodology that Gates's team applies to African American genealogy has been refined across hundreds of investigations, spanning more than a decade of television. They know where the records are, they know where the records end, and they know how to use genetic evidence to reach past the point where the paper trail dissolves. For a family like the Warwicks, Black Americans whose roots ran through the antebellum South, whose ancestors had been enslaved, and whose documentary history had been systematically erased by a legal system that classified people as property, that methodology was exactly what was needed. The methodology was the same one that had proved its power across dozens of similar investigations. Genealogists working through paper records, census data, estate inventories, and land filings combined with DNA analysis that could reach past the wall where the documents stopped. The goal was not simply to extend the family tree backward in time, it was to understand what had shaped it. On her paternal grandfather's side, they hit the wall almost immediately. The records thinned and then stopped, absorbed into the silence that surrounds every enslaved family in American records. The paper trail simply ended. No names, no origins, nothing that the documentary record could recover. On her paternal grandmother's side, a door opened. Dionne's paternal grandmother was a woman named Juanita Holland, also known as Needy. Juanita's mother was a woman named Clarkie Russ. Clarkie Russ was the daughter of Guy Russ and Marianne Russ, Dionne's great-great-grandparents living in Jackson County, Florida, documented in the 1870 census with their 5 children. The census was taken 5 years after emancipation. Both Guy and Marianne were adults when it was recorded, which meant they had both been adults during slavery. They had not been born into freedom. They had been born into bondage, and they had survived it, and they had emerged on the other side of emancipation with a family and a name and a location that the census could record. That name, Russ, was the key, and what it unlocked was not a celebration. It was a reckoning. When formerly enslaved people emerged from bondage after emancipation, many of them took the surnames of the people who had owned them. Not from loyalty, not from affection, from the simple arithmetic of survival in a world that suddenly required surnames and offered no other source for them. Guy Russ had taken the name of the family that had enslaved him, and that meant the researchers could search the records for a white family named Russ in Jackson County, Florida, and find the plantation where Dionne Warwick's great-great-grandfather had been held. The search led them to the 1860 census, specifically to a slave schedule filed for a white farmer named Joseph Russ. A slave schedule was a federal record that documented the enslaved people on a given property, not by name, but by age, gender, and color. Joseph Russ's schedule listed 31 enslaved people, 31 human beings reduced to data points. No names, no stories, no origins. Nothing that would allow a descendant to look at the record and say with certainty, that is my family. Except one thing, Guy Russ was born between 1814 and 1816. In 1860, the year of that census, he would have been between 44 and 46 years old. And on Joseph Russ's slave schedule, among 31 unnamed entries, there was a black male listed as 46 years old. That was almost certainly Guy, listed without his name, without his history, without anything that acknowledged him as a person, a number in a column, the property of Joseph Russ. Dionne Warwick sat with that record on camera. She saw the entry. She saw what her great-great-grandfather had been reduced to in the official accounting of the United States government. And she said what the record made undeniable, that there was no way around it. Every black family in America descended from people who had been through this. There was no version of her story that did not run through that wall, through those anonymous columns, through that system that classified human beings as property and kept records accordingly. What the record also made clear was the timeline. Guy Russ was approximately 50 years old when emancipation came in 1865. He had spent the majority of his life enslaved on Joseph Russ's plantation in Jackson County, Florida. He had spent 5 more years there after the 1860 census before freedom arrived. 5 more years of cotton, 5 more years of bondage, 5 more years of being listed as property in someone else's ledger while his name went unrecorded in any official document. When freedom came, he stayed in Jackson County. That decision, to remain in the same geography where he had been enslaved, to build a life on ground that had never belonged to him, was not unusual. It was the reality of emancipation for hundreds of thousands of formerly enslaved people across the South. Freedom arrived without land, without capital, without any of the infrastructure that would have made departure possible for most people. The Freedmen's Bureau had promised 40 acres and a mule. The promise was broken within months. What formerly enslaved people received instead was freedom in name, in a landscape still controlled by the people who had owned them, still organized around the plantation system that had defined every aspect of their lives. Staying was not surrendered. For most, it was the only option that existed. He built a family there. He gave his children a name that came from the man who had owned him, because there was no other name available, because the system that had enslaved him had also erased whatever name his family had carried before. His granddaughter Juanita carried that name into a marriage, and her descendants carried it forward until it reached Dionne Warwick's grandmother, and from her grandmother into Dionne herself, not as a surname, but as a bloodline, as a genetic inheritance, as the thread that the DNA would eventually trace all the way back to that slave schedule and the man listed as a black male, 46 years old, on a Florida cotton farm in 1860. Consider the weight of what that slave schedule represented, not just for Guy Russ, but for every family whose ancestor appears in one of those anonymous columns. The United States government conducted a census every 10 years. It counted the population. It recorded names, ages, occupations, property values, family relationships. For white Americans, the census is one of the most powerful genealogical tools available, a record of who people were, where they lived, what they owned, who they lived with. For enslaved people, the census was something else entirely, a separate schedule, a different kind of accounting. Not names, not relationships, not identities, just numbers, just data point organized by age, by color, and by gender in service of a system that needed to know the size of its labor force without needing to know anything about the human beings who composed it. The slave schedule was not a genealogical record, it was an inventory. The researchers then turned to what documents could not reach. The African origins that slavery had severed before any record existed to preserve them. When Dionne Warwick's DNA was analyzed, the results delivered a picture that was both confirming and specific in ways the paper trail could never be. Approximately 80% of her ancestry traced to sub-Saharan Africa. That was expected, consistent with what history would predict for a Black American family whose roots ran through the antebellum South. But the breakdown within that 80% was specific in ways that mattered. 24% of her ancestry pointed to Nigeria, 23% to Benin and Togo, 14% to Cameroon, Congo, and the Western Bantu peoples, 9% to Mali, 6% to Ivory Coast and Ghana, 4% to Senegal. These are not generic African results. They are a geographic record of the transatlantic slave trade made visible in a laboratory. Nigeria, Benin, and Togo include the Bight of Benin, one of the most heavily trafficked regions in the entire history of the trade. The Yoruba, the Fon, and the Yu were peoples whose descendants were taken in enormous numbers and moved across the Atlantic to the plantations of the American South. Cameroon and the Congo formed part of the Western Bantu corridor that supplied another massive portion of the enslaved population brought to North America. Mali and Senegal represent the Senegambian coast, among the earliest African regions drawn into the Atlantic system. Dionne Warwick's DNA was not a single African origin story. It was several, drawn from across the western half of the continent, from the communities that the slave trade had targeted most heavily over 4 centuries. Each percentage point in those results represents not just an ethnic group, but a forced crossing. People taken from specific places, moved across an ocean, stripped of their names and languages and origins, and deposited into a plantation system that kept records of their economic value while erasing everything else about them. The European ancestry in her results, approximately 19%, distributed across English, Irish, Scottish, and smaller amounts of Germanic and other European origins, told its own story. 19% is not a distant connection separated by generations. It points to European ancestors who were close. The generational math is straightforward. Each generation back reduces the contribution by half. A 19% figure means European ancestors within a relatively small number of generations, ancestors whose contribution to Dionne Warwick's bloodline was too substantial to be ancient or coincidental. The mechanism was the same one that runs through the DNA of millions of African American families. Enslaved women had no legal standing to refuse any man who held power over them. Children born from those encounters were automatically enslaved, classified as property regardless of their father's identity. The father faced no legal consequence. The child carried the biological inheritance of the man who owned their mother, while that man's name went unrecorded in any document connected to the child. The DNA confirmed that this had happened somewhere in Dionne Warwick's bloodline. It could not name the man. It could not recover the circumstances. It could not give the woman involved her voice or her story or the dignity the system had stripped from her. It could only confirm, in the cold language of genetic percentages, that the history had left its mark. Now consider what that history produced. The Drinkard family left Georgia in the 1920s. They did not leave by choice. Not entirely. Dionne's grandfather, Nitch, had built something rare for a black man in the post-Reconstruction South. His family owned land in Georgia in the early 1900s, a time when most black Americans in the South were landless sharecroppers working someone else's fields for a share of the harvest that was always tilted against them. The Drinkards had land. They had something. In 1923, Nitch defaulted on a bank loan, and the family's property was sold at auction. The researchers could not confirm exactly what had happened. The records were incomplete, the circumstances unclear. But 1923 in Georgia was not an abstract economic moment. It was the tail end of the Red Summer and the years of racial terror that followed, a period when black landowners across the South were being systematically dispossessed through violence, intimidation, legal manipulation, and financial pressure. What the Drinkards lost was not just property, it was the foundation that Reconstruction had tried to build, and that the decades that followed had been devoted to dismantling. They moved to Newark, New Jersey. Nitch found work as a molder at Essex Foundry. He raised his children in a northern city with the gospel music tradition that the family had carried out of Georgia, the same tradition that would eventually produce the Drinkard singers, and from the Drinkard singers, a family of voices that would reshape American music. Lee Drinkard managed the group and raised Dionne. Cissy Drinkard became Cissy Houston and raised Whitney. Two lines of descendants from the same gospel family, both carrying the same ancestry, both carrying the same bloodline that traced back to Guy Russ and the plantation in Jackson County, and through the DNA further back still to the specific regions of West and Central Africa from which the slave trade had taken people and delivered them into a world that recorded their dollar value and forgot their names. Dionne Warwick did not know any of this before the investigation. The family did not talk about it. The specific details, the slave schedule, the 31 unnamed entries, the one black male listed as 46 years old, whom the researchers believe was Guy, none of that had been passed down. What had been passed down was the music, the gospel tradition, the sense of a family that had survived something without being told exactly what it had survived. The DNA gave more of it back. Not all. The paternal grandfather's line remained out of reach. The wall held there, and the records offered nothing before emancipation, the African origins before the crossing, the specific communities, the specific people, the specific languages and traditions that were taken aboard the slave ships and carried across the Atlantic. Those details cannot be recovered from a DNA percentage breakdown. The science can tell you that 24% of your ancestry traces to Nigeria. It cannot tell you which people, which community, which specific individuals were taken and from where. And the question of the European ancestry, the 19%, the unnamed men, in the plantation system whose encounters with enslaved women left a genetic mark that the DNA can measure but cannot name. That question remains open. Science made it undeniable. It could not make it specific. What remains is the name, not Warwick, not the spelling error that followed Dionne from the printing plant to every record label, every concert program, every award she ever received. The other name, Russ. The name her great-great-grandfather carried out of slavery because the system that had enslaved him had also taken whatever name his family had used before, had taken it so completely that no record, no document, and no DNA test has yet been able to recover it. Guy Russ survived. He built a family in Jackson County after emancipation. He gave his descendants a surname that came from the man who had owned him, and that surname moved forward through generations until it reached Clarkie Russ, and from Clarkie to Juanita, and from Juanita into the family tree that eventually produced one of the most celebrated voices in American music. The name on the record was never his. The DNA that runs through his descendants is. And somewhere in that DNA, encoded in the genetic record that survived everything the system designed to erase it, is the origin story of a family that was never supposed to have one. Dionne Warwick carried a name that was a printing error. Her ancestor carried a name that was a system. Both of them were given identities that belonged to someone else. The science recovered what it could. The name that came before Russ, the name that Guy's mother or father carried before the plantation, before the crossing, before the trade, that name is still missing. It may always be missing. What the DNA confirmed is that the strength Dionne Warwick said she wanted to understand, the strength she knew was in her family without knowing where it came from, it came from people who survived what was designed to destroy them. They built families inside a system that refused to record their names. They carried a bloodline forward through every generation that followed until it arrived here. The name on the cover of the record was wrong. The bloodline behind the voice was real. And the question the science cannot answer, whose name did Guy carry before the plantation took it, is the one that history still owes him. It has not yet delivered it.